Hello and welcome back to the last section of the Creating Grant Application Components module as part of your online grant training. As we look at our last section for this particular module, we will be talking about standard grant attachments. What are they? How can we help take the pressure off of our grant application deadlines to get those ready? And are there any other tips or tricks that we should know? When we think about grant application attachments, these are things that are often exactly the same over the course of your entire fiscal year. So whether your fiscal year is a calendar year or is July 1 to June 30 or something even different, like October 1 to September 30, grant attachments are always something that we can get buttoned up and then use for likely the next 12 months. That is something that can take a lot of stress off of our shoulders as grant writers and grant professionals. So here's a list of some of the key things that you might be able to gather in advance and have ready to go, maybe both on your server and potentially even as a hard copy. Your IRS determination letter. I've put here 501c3 since that is such a common IRS determination when we talk about grant seeking, but there are numerous other grant structures, organizational structures that are eligible for grants. So what is the letter that shows the type of organization that you are that will align with your grant maker's eligibility criteria? You also want to have your previous year's financial statements. What do your books show? Your grant makers want to be able to see whether or not you've been running at a surplus or at a deficit, to see what sort of assets you might have on hand. And they will often, in addition to asking for these year-end financials, they will also often ask for a formal audit. Now, depending on the size of your organization, depending on the state where you're operating, you might be small enough that you are not required to have a formal audit conducted. I'm not talking about the larger federal audits. If you receive X amount in federal funding, you reach an audit threshold. I'm even talking about a basic audit by a CPA. So the reason I put if appropriate is that not all organizations will have an audit that they would provide as an attachment, but many will. You also want to ensure that you've got your most current board roster on hand. So whenever there is an addition or someone leaves your board of directors, make sure that this roster gets updated. Ideally, the board roster that's being maintained related to grant attachments has as much of the common information available as possible. To simply have a list of names that serve on the board might mean that you still are spending time on this attachment when under the pressure of a deadline. So your basic board roster might also have not only the names of the individuals, what are their positions on your board, how long have they been on your board? Do they have a limit to the current term that they're serving? Do they have an affiliation that should be noted? So that would usually mean, where do they work? Or are they retired? And if they're retired from what organization or what career? For some organizations, they might even want to know where are the board members based. Not necessarily their personal address, but what is the city and the state where they reside. So having as much information as available as possible with the board roster is really what's the most helpful, because then you can consolidate it to something smaller when needed. What takes more time is gathering that extra information if you don't have it on hand at the beginning. What is your operating budget? Again, a very common grant attachment. What is the board-approved operating budget that shows your best laid plan in terms of your expenses and your revenues? Are you anticipating operating with a balanced budget, or do you have a slight surplus or deficit that is projected by your board? That, when paired with your financial information of the past year, does give grant makers a strong understanding of your financial position. Related to the operating budget, if you are asking for a specific project or program, the grant maker would most likely want to see the project or program budget cost. That's a portion of the approved operating budget. This might look exactly like the total cost column in their grant maker budget form. Hard to say, but if your organization has program or project specific budgets that are approved as part of the operating budget, great to have those on hand as attachments as well. Now, in our last section in this module, we talked about resumes and bio sketches. So hopefully it's no surprise and it's no stress that you see those on this list for attachments that you can work on and gather in advance. And the last item here on the list is about an annual report. Annual reports, not a text-based response about your accomplishments and the work that you've done, but rather more the glossy type of annual reports that might highlight programmatic successes, perhaps have a list of the donors by different giving categories. Those type of annual reports are often not a requirement, but an optional attachment that grant makers will allow for. If you have one available, this is a great way for a grant maker to see some of your success stories and something that's probably a little more colorful and maybe even has some pictures, some success stories than what the grant application might allow for. Now, just because one is being asked for doesn't mean you should go create one, but if you have one, you certainly should attach it. Now, with that long list of attachments, will grant makers always want all of those? No. But you might have all of them available. And what should you do? The general rule is that you should only provide grant makers with the attachments that they have requested. You do not want to provide grant makers with more than they have asked for, because what you're doing is, quite frankly, disrespecting their process a bit and giving them more to process in order to review your application. That doesn't usually put you in a good light. If you have other attachments already at the ready that you think would be amazing, one option would be to reference them in a cover email or a cover letter and offer that they're available should the grant maker be interested. That would be how I suggest you handle that. But please stick to the general rule: you only provide the attachments that are requested. Now, that being said, of course, there is an exception. What if a grant maker in their online portal or in their guidelines offers you the chance to include an optional attachment, or asks the question, is there anything additional that you would like to share with us? Please share your response or upload information here. What do you do then? Here's the rule that we follow. Only provide one additional thing. One thing, not two things which have been combined into one PDF, or two images combined into one file. One thing. If a grant maker gives you that option for an additional or optional attachment, pick one thing that adds to your story, but actually your application would still be okay and highly competitive and well understood without it, but one thing that adds to your story. That is what I would recommend you handle you upload in that specific situation. Now, as we have made it to the end of this module together, in addition to having my email so that you can reach out with questions, please know that there are many other ways that you can choose to reach me if you want follow-up information or free downloads related to this particular topic. So here's my email one more time as we close out this module. It's Diane at dhleonardconsulting.com. Now, these modules, they're brought to you by HRI, the New York State Department of Health and HRSA. So please remember that these modules are brought to you by those funding sources, and that if you need to reference back to the sponsor number supporting this particular module, it's available on this last slide. Thank you again for participating in this module. We look forward to seeing you in future modules.